We're going to be giving and providing it to the farmers in economic assistance, and we love our farmers. And as you know, the farmers like me, they're the backbone of our country. So we're going to use that money to provide $12 billion in economic assistance to American farmers. $12 billion is a lot of money, Meryl. What do you think?
Black Farmers and Agriculturalists Association and Corporation say the problem isn't the money itself. It's who gets it, who doesn't, and why. Today, the association explained why they're rejecting the $12 billion federal farm assistance program tied to the trade impacts and tariffs.
It's not a matter of our being anti-farmers. I am a farmer. I was born a farmer. I live to be a farmer. I will die a farmer.
Africa was told to trust the system, and farmers were told the market was fair. Then $12 billion proved otherwise. When the United States bailed out its agriculture, it didn't just rescue farmers at home, it quietly rewrote the rules for everyone else. Prices shifted, markets warped, and African farmers paid the cost without a single vote.
Black farmers in Memphis are rejecting a piece of multi-billion-dollar federal agricultural relief. You see, the farmers claim the crops they grow aren't actually covered under that program. Today, the black farmers and agriculturalists announced they'd be opting out. Earlier this week, President Trump gave out $12 billion to provide relief to farmers who grow soybeans, wheat, barley, corn, and some other commodities. However, the Bridge Assistance Program excludes items like tobacco, sugarcane, peanuts.
Africa didn't call it aid. Africa called it a scam. Not because the money vanished, but because the truth did. The same system that demanded discipline from Africa suddenly protected America without hesitation. And once farmers saw how fast the rules changed for the powerful, the illusion collapsed. This wasn't just about crops, it was about who the system was really built for.
Donald Trump's tariffs have destroyed the economy for farmers in America. Those white farmers yell, scream, holler. And so now Trump says, hey, I'm proposing $12 billion in a relief package. He's describing it as a lifeline for growers affected by rising costs and trade policies.
The organization representing black farmers across the country opting out of President Trump's $12 billion Farmer Bridge Assistance Program.
I think that it's time that fairness becomes, in a very simple word, something that the government would embrace. Fairness.
It's not a matter of don't give it to A. The question is, if you're going to give it to A, why are you not going to give it to B?
When the United States announced a $12 billion agricultural bailout, the message was framed as protection. Farmers, officials said, needed relief from global trade disruptions. The funds were presented as a lifeline, fast, decisive, and necessary. But outside Washington, particularly across Africa's agricultural communities, the narrative sounded very different. Africa called it a warning. From the outset, African farmers and cooperatives followed the bailout closely, not because they expected assistance, but because they recognized the pattern. Subsidies of this scale did not merely support domestic producers. They reshaped global markets, distorted prices, and shifted risk outward, often onto farmers thousands of miles away. What the United States described as emergency relief, Africa increasingly described as a system dressed up as rescue. The concern centered on scale and speed. $12 billion moved rapidly into American agricultural supply chains. Corn, soy, cotton, and other commodities received price support that insulated U.S. producers from market consequences. Production continued uninterrupted, surpluses accumulated, and when domestic markets absorbed what they could, the excess moved outward. Africa felt the pressure almost immediately. Prices on international markets dipped. African exporters found themselves competing not with efficiency, but with subsidized resilience. Farmers who relied on open market pricing suddenly faced distorted benchmarks they could not match. African agricultural groups began speaking openly. They did not accuse the United States of illegality. They accused it of hypocrisy. For years, Africa had been told to liberalize markets, reduce subsidies, and accept global competition. Structural adjustment programs, trade agreements, and development advice had emphasized discipline and exposure to market forces. Now, the same system allowed the world's largest economy to shield its farmers with billions in public funds. Africa called the contradiction a scam not because money was stolen, but because the rules changed depending on who was struggling. The bailout, African observers argued, did not fix trade damage. It masked it. Instead of addressing structural trade tensions, the United States transferred the cost inward temporarily and outward permanently. Domestic stability was purchased at the expense of global balance. African farmers understood this mechanism well. They had lived through it. In the past, similar subsidy programs in wealthy nations had flooded African markets with underpriced imports. Local producers were pushed out, rural economies weakened, dependency increased, recovery took decades. The $12 billion bailout revived those memories. African cotton producers noticed American exports becoming more competitive despite ongoing trade disruptions. Grain farmers saw price signals shift unexpectedly. Even sectors not directly competing felt secondary effects as land use, logistics, and financing adjusted around subsidized output. Africa's exposure was indirect but real. The bailout also raised questions about transparency. African analysts scrutinized distribution mechanisms. Large agribusiness entities appeared better positioned to absorb funds quickly. Smaller producers, despite rhetorical emphasis, seemed less visible in outcomes. This concentration of benefit mirrored patterns Africa had seen before, where relief programs reinforced existing power structures. Africa did not frame this as corruption, it framed it as design, a system that claimed to support farmers but stabilized exporters, a program that claimed to protect livelihoods but preserved dominance. As scrutiny grew, African agricultural unions coordinated messaging. The bailout was not illegal, they said. It was inequitable. It was presented as rescue while functioning as insulation. Africa's frustration extended beyond economics. There was a moral dimension. African farmers were routinely told that subsidies distorted markets and discouraged efficiency. Now, distortion was acceptable when it served American interests. Efficiency was suspended when power demanded protection. The word scam gained traction not as an accusation of theft, but as a description of narrative. Africa argued that the bailout sold a story that did not match its impact. Washington's response focused on domestic necessity. Officials emphasized farmer hardship, political urgency, and national responsibility. Africa did not dispute American farmers' struggles. It questioned why global consequences were ignored. The bailout did not include safeguards for external impact. There were no compensatory measures for affected producers abroad, no consultations, no acknowledgement that global markets were interconnected. Africa interpreted the silence as intent. By shielding domestic producers without adjusting export behavior, the United States effectively exported volatility. African farmers absorbed shocks they did not create. This imbalance fueled calls for change. African policymakers began discussing defensive strategies, tariff adjustments, regional procurement, value addition acceleration. The bailout reinforced the need to reduce vulnerability to external subsidies. Ironically, the bailout strengthened Africa's resolve. If powerful nations would protect their farmers at any cost, Africa would have to do the same even if global institutions disapproved. The exposure of the bailout's effects did not come from leaked documents or investigations. It came from outcomes. African farmers compared seasons. Input costs remained high. Output prices fell. Credit tightened. The pattern repeated across regions and crops. Africa concluded that the bailout was not an isolated event. It was a reminder that global trade rules were flexible for some and rigid for others. A reminder that fairness was often rhetorical. A reminder that resilience required autonomy. The $12 billion bailout may have stabilized American politics, but it destabilized trust. Africa did not demand apology, it demanded recognition, and as farmers across the continent compared notes, the verdict hardened. This was not relief. It was redistribution disguised as rescue, and the exposure had only begun. As the effects of the bailout rippled outward, Africa's response evolved from observation to coordination. What began as farmer-level frustration quietly entered policy rooms, trade councils, and regional summits. The issue was no longer just price distortion, it was exposure. African governments recognized that the bailout revealed a structural vulnerability they could no longer ignore. When a single policy decision in the United States could shift global prices overnight, Africa's agricultural independence was still incomplete. The realization was unsettling. Across West Africa, discussions focused on commodity reliance. Shea, cocoa, cotton, and grains were still tied to pricing mechanisms set far beyond African borders. Even when African production was efficient, pricing power remained external. The bailout confirmed that market discipline applied selectively. East Africa reached similar conclusions. Producers there noticed how quickly global buyers redirected sourcing once subsidized American supply regained competitiveness. Long-term contracts were renegotiated, spot markets softened. Farmers who had planned seasons based on projected demand suddenly faced uncertainty. The bailout had not targeted Africa, but Africa was collateral. This recognition shifted the language of debate. The question was no longer whether the bailout was fair. The question became how Africa could insulate itself from similar shocks in the future. One answer gained traction quickly: value retention. If raw commodities were vulnerable to price manipulation, then processing, branding, and regional consumption offered protection. African agricultural planners began accelerating strategies that had long existed on paper but lacked urgency. Processing zones were prioritized, export bans on unprocessed goods were reconsidered, regional trade agreements gained renewed importance. The bailout did what years of development advice had failed to do. It made self-protection politically urgent. The United States, meanwhile, remained focused inward. Domestic narratives emphasized stability. The bailout was portrayed as successful, efficient, and necessary. Production continued. Political pressure eased. There was little incentive to examine external consequences. Africa interpreted that silence as confirmation. Global fairness was not part of the equation. As this understanding deepened, African farmers reframed their position. They were no longer petitioners in a global system. They were participants learning its rules, and the rules were clear. When powerful economies faced risk, they socialized losses. When weaker economies faced the fallout, they were told to adjust. Africa began adjusting on its own terms. Import substitution gained momentum. Governments encouraged domestic procurement for school feeding programs and public institutions. Regional buyers replaced some international contracts. These shifts were small individually but significant collectively. They represented a break in habit. African farmers also became more vocal in international forums, not confrontational but firm. Subsidies were not condemned outright. Their asymmetry was. Africa argued that if subsidies were acceptable tools, then developing economies deserved equal policy space. If free markets could be suspended in emergencies, then emergencies needed a broader definition. The bailout blurred moral lines. It weakened the authority of lectures on discipline, reform, and exposure. Africa listened politely, and then acted independently. Interestingly, the bailout also affected relations among African countries. Export-dependent states realized that competition among themselves only amplified vulnerability. Regional coordination became a strategic necessity. Shared storage facilities, harmonized standards, and coordinated pricing mechanisms were explored. Africa began thinking like a bloc. The narrative of the bailout as a scam evolved as well. It no longer meant deception in intent. It meant deception in framing, a system that claimed neutrality while favoring scale, a narrative that celebrated resilience while exporting risk. African media amplified this framing. Stories focused on farmers who did everything right and still lost ground. Not because of drought or inefficiency, but because of distant policy decisions. The contrast was stark. When Africa faced crises, assistance came with conditions. When the United States faced disruption, assistance came with speed and scale. The bailout unintentionally highlighted inequality embedded in the global system. Even so, Africa did not seek confrontation. There were no sanctions, no retaliatory tariffs, no formal disputes. Instead, there was quiet recalibration, trade diversification accelerated, partnerships expanded beyond traditional buyers, South-South trade gained new urgency. Africa began negotiating from a position shaped by caution rather than optimism. Trust, once eroded, did not return easily. The bailout became a case study in African policy schools and agricultural colleges, not as an example of wrongdoing, but as a lesson in realism. Markets were not neutral. Rules were not fixed. Security came from leverage. African farmers, long portrayed as victims of global forces, emerged as analysts of them. They understood that survival required more than productivity. It required insulation from volatility created elsewhere. The United States may have stabilized its agricultural sector in the short term, but in doing so, it accelerated Africa's long-term departure from dependency. That irony did not go unnoticed. The bailout was meant to preserve influence. Instead, it exposed its limits. Africa's conclusion was measured but firm. If the global system allowed powerful nations to shield themselves without consequence, then Africa had to reduce exposure to that system. The scam was not the money. The scam was the promise that the system treated everyone equally, and once that promise was exposed, it could never be fully restored. Africa moved forward not in anger but in clarity. And clarity, once gained, does not fade.